Upon hearing the gardener play the acoustic guitar, the elderly woman was paralyzed by the melody, the very same one her son used to play before he disappeared 30 years ago. The elderly woman, Margaret, lived alone in a large, time-worn Victorian house at the edge of town. The gardens, once lush and vibrant, had fallen into disrepair, overgrown with weeds and tangled ivy. It was here, in the decaying beauty of her home, that Margaret found herself paralyzed by a melody she hadn't heard in 3 decades. The gardener, Ethan, was a young man in his mid-20s. He had been hired only a few weeks earlier by Margaret's daughter, Claire, to restore the once glorious garden. His quiet demeanor and skilled hands quickly won Margaret's trust, even though she kept their interactions brief. Margaret, a woman in her late 70s, had grown weary of companionship. Life had taken her through unspeakable loss. Her son, Michael, had vanished without a trace when he was only 17. The pain of his disappearance carved a hollow in her heart, one that no amount of time or therapy could fill. Over the years, she had closed herself off, retreating into the quiet solace of her empty home. Ethan often worked in silence, save for the occasional hum of an old tune. One crisp autumn afternoon, Margaret heard the faint sound of an acoustic guitar drifting through her open window. She paused, her heart skipping a beat as the melody washed over her. It was hauntingly familiar, tugging at buried memories. Stepping out onto her porch, she saw Ethan sitting under the ancient oak tree, guitar in hand. His fingers moved skillfully over the strings, producing a tune that sent chills down her spine. Margaret gripped the wooden railing for support as tears welled in her eyes. "That song," she whispered, barely audible. "Where did you learn that song?" Ethan stopped abruptly, startled by her sudden presence. "Oh, Mrs. Grant," he said, standing up quickly. "I'm sorry if I disturbed you." "I didn't mean—" "No," Margaret interrupted, her voice trembling. "Tell me, where did you learn that song?" Ethan hesitated, glancing down at the guitar. "It's an old melody my grandfather used to play," he said. "I've known it since I was a kid." Margaret's heart pounded. "Your grandfather?" she asked, her voice barely steady. "Who was he?" Ethan looked puzzled but answered, "His name was Richard. He passed away a few years ago." Margaret's knees nearly gave way. The name Richard wasn't one she expected, but the connection couldn't be a coincidence. "Please sit," she said, motioning to the bench on the porch. "Tell me more about your grandfather." As they sat, Ethan spoke fondly of Richard, describing him as a man who loved music and often played for the family during gatherings. Margaret listened intently, every word deepening her intrigue. Could Richard have known her son? Could he have been a link to the life Michael lived after he disappeared? "Do you have any old photos of your grandfather?" Margaret asked, her voice tinged with desperation. Ethan nodded. "I think I have some at home. I could bring them tomorrow." Margaret's mind raced with possibilities. She hadn't felt this mix of fear and hope in years. If Ethan's grandfather had played the same melody Michael used to compose, there had to be a connection. But why hadn't Michael returned? What had kept him away all these years? The rest of the day passed in a blur. That night, Margaret sat by the fireplace, clutching a photograph of Michael. The young boy in the picture smiled brightly, his eyes full of dreams. "Where did you go?" she whispered, her voice breaking. The next morning, Ethan arrived early, a small leather-bound photo album in hand. Margaret's hands shook as she flipped through the pages, her breath hitching when she saw a familiar face. It was Michael, older but unmistakably him, standing beside Ethan's grandfather. Tears streamed down her cheeks as a flood of emotions overwhelmed her. Ethan, noticing her reaction, asked gently, "Mrs. Grant, do you know him?" Margaret nodded, unable to speak at first. Finally, she managed, "That's my son, Michael." Ethan's eyes widened in shock. "Your son? But my grandfather never mentioned." Margaret cut him off, clutching his hand. "Please, tell me everything you know." Margaret's life, once marked by silent grief, took on a renewed sense of purpose. Each morning, she would find herself watching Ethan from her window, the soft strums of his guitar bringing a peculiar comfort. The revelation about Michael had sparked something in her, a delicate balance of hope and fear. Ethan, too, felt the weight of their shared mission. His grandfather's memories, often conveyed through songs and stories, had always seemed like fragments of a life well lived. Now, those fragments were keys to unraveling a mystery. Ethan's quiet resilience made him a steady companion for Margaret, and their shared moments of reflection began to build an unlikely friendship. The house, though large, carried an oppressive silence. Margaret had lived with it for so long that she barely noticed anymore. The rooms still held faint echoes of laughter and music, but they were overshadowed by years of solitude. Her daughter, Claire, visited occasionally but lived far away, juggling her own family responsibilities. Ethan, by contrast, came from a modest background. He had grown up listening to his grandfather's tales, many of which centered around music and the connections it forged. Richard had been a wandering spirit, and Ethan inherited his love for stories and melodies. Working in Margaret's garden felt like a natural extension of his life, a way to bring forgotten beauty back to light. During their conversations, Ethan revealed snippets of his own life, how music had shaped his upbringing, how he found solace in tending to overgrown spaces. Margaret, usually reserved, began to open up about Michael, sharing anecdotes from his childhood. These exchanges, while simple, laid the groundwork for their deepening bond. One day, as they sifted through Ethan's grandfather's belongings, they found an old journal. The leather-bound book was filled with song lyrics, sketches, and occasional notes. Among them was a page that stood out, a sketch of a boy sitting under a tree, guitar in hand. Margaret's breath caught as she recognized the tree from her own backyard. Michael used to sit there, she murmured, her voice thick with emotion. He said it was his thinking spot. Ethan studied the sketch. It looks like my grandfather knew your son better than we thought. Further pages revealed more connections. There were mentions of a music festival they both attended in a small town where they had performed together. Margaret's heart swelled with a mix of longing and determination. We need to go there, she said firmly. If Michael left any trace, it might still be waiting for us. Ethan agreed, and together they planned a trip to the town mentioned in the journal. Margaret, who hadn't traveled in years, felt a flicker of excitement beneath her nerves. For the first time in decades, she was stepping out of her comfort zone, driven by a purpose that outweighed her fears. Their journey was marked by quiet anticipation. Along the way, Ethan's music filled the silence, each melody weaving a sense of hope. Margaret found herself reflecting on the life she had built around Michael's absence and the possibility that those walls might finally come down. When they arrived, the town's charm was undeniable. It was small, nestled between rolling hills, with a central square that buzzed with life. Margaret felt a pang of nostalgia, imagining Michael walking these streets, playing his music for strangers. Their first stop was a local cafe that hosted live performances. The owner, a middle-aged woman, named and greeted them warmly. When they mentioned Richard and Michael, her eyes lit up with recognition. I remember them, and said, her voice tinged with fondness. They used to play here every weekend. Michael was a quiet one, but when he played, you could feel every note, and disappeared briefly and returned with a photograph. It showed Michael and Richard, side by side, guitars in hand, smiling under the cafe's sign. Margaret's fingers trembled as she held the photo, her eyes brimming with tears. Do you know where Michael went? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper, and shook her head. After Richard stopped coming, I didn't see him again. But there's someone who might know, a man named Ben. He and Michael were close. With a new lead in hand, Margaret and Ethan set out to find Ben, their resolve stronger than ever. The next step in their journey led Margaret and Ethan to the outskirts of town, where Ben, a former musician, ran a small instrument repair shop. The scent of aged wood and varnish filled the air as they entered, the soft chime of the bell announcing their arrival. Ben, a man in his early 60s with graying hair and kind eyes, looked up from a guitar he was restoring. How can I help you? He asked, his voice warm but cautious. Margaret stepped forward, clutching the photograph and had given her. We're looking for someone, she said, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions beneath. Michael Grant. I was told you knew him. Ben's expression softened as he glanced at the photo. Michael, he said, almost to himself. It's been years since I heard that name. Ethan leaned in, sensing Ben's hesitance. We believe he's my grandfather's friend, he explained. Richard. They played music together. Ben nodded slowly, his gaze shifting between them. Michael and Richard were like brothers. They had a bond through their music, something rare. But Michael, he carried a weight that music couldn't lift. Margaret felt her heart tighten. What happened to him? Why did he leave? Ben sighed, setting the guitar aside. Michael loved deeply, but he was haunted by the idea that he couldn't live up to those he loved. He felt he'd failed as a son, as a brother. He thought by leaving, he was sparing you the pain of his shortcomings. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "He didn't fail me," she whispered. "He was my son, my everything." Ben gestured for them to sit, pulling out a worn journal from beneath the counter. "Michael left this with me before he disappeared," he said. "He asked me to keep it safe in case someone ever came looking." Margaret's hands trembled as she opened the journal. Inside, she found pages filled with Michael's thoughts, sketches, and music. Each entry painted a picture of a man torn between his love for his family and his fear of not being enough. One entry caught her eye. "To my mother, if you ever find this, know that I love you. I've always loved you, even when I couldn't face you. Music has been my way of staying close, even from afar." Tears streamed down her face as she clutched the journal. "He never stopped thinking of us," she said, her voice breaking. Ben placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Michael's last words to me were about finding peace. He hoped that one day he could return, but he needed to heal first." Ethan spoke up, his voice filled with quiet determination. "Do you know where he went?" Ben hesitated for a moment before nodding. "There's a cabin deep in the woods by the lake. Michael used to go there to write and play. If he's anywhere, it's there." Margaret and Ethan exchanged a determined glance. This was their next destination. The journey to the cabin was filled with quiet anticipation. Margaret and Ethan drove along winding forest roads, the dense canopy of trees casting dappled shadows on the path. The air grew cooler as they neared the lake, the sound of rustling leaves and distant bird calls creating a serene yet charged atmosphere. As they approached, the sight of the cabin took Margaret's breath away. It was a modest structure, weathered by time but well kept, nestled beside the calm waters of the lake. Margaret couldn't help but imagine Michael here, finding solace in the beauty of nature. Before they could step inside, Ethan paused. "Mrs. Grant," he said, his tone careful. "If Michael is here, he might not be ready for this. Are you prepared for what we might find?" Margaret nodded, her resolve unwavering. "I've waited 30 years for this moment, Ethan. Whatever happens, I need to see him." Ethan took a deep breath and knocked on the cabin door. There was no answer. He tried again, and when silence persisted, he cautiously pushed the door open. The interior was simple yet cozy, with a small kitchen, a wood-burning stove, and a corner dedicated to music. A guitar rested on a stand, and sheets of handwritten music were scattered across a worn table. Margaret's eyes locked onto the guitar. "That's his," she whispered, stepping closer. She gently touched the instrument, her fingers trembling as if it might dissolve under her touch. Ethan began looking around, and in a small room at the back, they found more signs of Michael's presence. Personal belongings, clothing, and a collection of letters. One of them was addressed to Margaret but had never been sent. Margaret carefully unfolded the letter, her hand shaking. The words were raw and heartfelt, revealing Michael's deepest thoughts and regrets. "Dear Mom, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I hope someday you'll understand why I left. I wasn't strong enough to face you after everything. I convinced myself that you'd be better off without me, that my absence would spare you the pain of my failures. But not a day goes by that I don't think of you, that I don't miss the life we shared. Music has been my refuge, my way of holding on to you. Every song I write carries a piece of our memories. If you're reading this, it means I've found a way back to you, or maybe you found your way to me. Love always, Michael." Tears blurred Margaret's vision as she read. Ethan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, silently offering his support. Their search of the cabin revealed another clue, a map with a marked trail leading deeper into the woods. Ethan unfolded it, noting a point labeled Reflection Point. "It looks like a spot he visited often," Ethan said. "Maybe he's there." Margaret's heart raced. "Let's go." They followed the trail, the dense forest gradually giving way to a clearing overlooking the lake. There, sitting on a fallen log with a guitar in hand, what a man. His back was turned, but Margaret knew instantly it was Michael. Margaret froze as her eyes locked onto the figure sitting by the lake. The years had changed him. His hair was streaked with gray, his posture more reflective, but there was no mistaking her son. Every fiber of her being screamed to run to him, but she hesitated, afraid that the slightest sound would shatter the moment. Ethan, standing beside her, gently nudged her forward. "Go to him," he whispered. Taking a deep breath, Margaret stepped onto the soft grass, her heart pounding with every step. As she neared, the familiar melody of Michael's music reached her ears. It was the same song Ethan had played, the one that had started this journey. Michael, she called softly, her voice trembling. The man turned slowly, his eyes widening as they met hers. For a moment, neither of them moved. Time seemed to stand still, the weight of 30 years of separation filling the air between them. Mom. Michael's voice was barely audible, a mix of disbelief and emotion. Margaret nodded, tears streaming down her face. It's me, Michael. Michael set the guitar aside and stood, his movements hesitant as if he feared this was a dream. How did you find me? Margaret took another step closer. Your music led me here, she said, her voice breaking. I've missed you every single day. The two stood facing each other, the silence heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Michael closed the distance, pulling his mother into a tight embrace. Years of pain and longing melted away as they held each other, the sounds of the lake and forest fading into the background. After a long moment, they sat on the fallen log, their hands still clasped as if letting go would break the fragile reality. Ethan stayed at a respectful distance, giving them space but remaining within earshot. I thought I'd never see you again, Margaret said, her voice filled with both relief and sadness. Why, Michael? Why did you leave? Michael sighed, his gaze fixed on the shimmering lake. I didn't leave because of you, Mom. I left because of me. I couldn't bear the weight of my own expectations. Every decision I made, every failure, it felt like I was letting you down. Margaret shook her head, her grip tightening on his hand. You were never a failure. You were my son, and that was enough. Michael's voice wavered as he continued. I thought by leaving, I'd spare you the burden of my struggles. I wanted to find myself, to be someone you could be proud of. But the longer I stayed away, the harder it was to come back. Margaret's heart ached at his words. Michael, the only burden I've ever carried was not knowing where you were, or if you were safe. Your absence left a hole in my heart that nothing could fill. Michael looked at her, his eyes glistening with tears. I'm so sorry, Mom. I was selfish. I thought I was protecting you, but all I did was cause more pain. Margaret reached up to touch his face, her expression filled with unconditional love. You're here now. That's all that matters. Ethan chose this moment to approach, sensing that his presence might now be welcome. Mr. Grant, he said softly, your mother isn't the only one who's been searching for you. Michael turned to him, his brow furrowed in curiosity. And you are? I'm Ethan, he said, extending a hand. My grandfather, Richard, was your friend. Your music brought us together. Michael's expression softened as recognition dawned. Richard, he murmured, shaking Ethan's hand. He was a good man. We spent a lot of time playing music together. Ethan smiled. His stories and your melody led us here. It's like he was guiding us. Michael nodded, his gaze returning to his mother. I didn't realize how much of an impact our music had. It was the one thing that kept me connected to you. Margaret squeezed his hand. Your music was always a part of our family. Even when you were gone, it brought me comfort. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the lake, the three of them sat together, sharing stories and memories. For the first time in decades, Margaret felt a sense of peace. The void left by Michael's absence was beginning to heal, filled with the promise of a renewed connection. Michael, too, felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The guilt and fear that had driven him away were slowly being replaced by hope and a desire to rebuild the life he had left behind. This isn't the end, Margaret said, her voice filled with quiet determination. It's a new beginning. Michael nodded, his eyes reflecting the same resolve. I want to come home, Mom. If you'll have me. Margaret's smile was radiant, her tears now of joy. I've been waiting for this moment for 30 years. Of course, I'll have you. As they made their way back to the cabin, the melody of their shared past lingered in the air, a testament to the unbreakable bond of family and the healing power of forgiveness. The journey back to Margaret's home was quiet, but the silence was no longer heavy with the weight of unspoken sorrow. Instead, it carried a sense of reflection, of lives beginning to mend. Michael sat in the passenger seat, his gaze fixed on the rolling hills and distant trees. Margaret, behind the wheel for the first time in years, felt a renewed vigor. Ethan followed behind in his truck, giving them space but remaining a silent supporter of this reunion. As they neared the house, Margaret spoke softly. It hasn't changed much, has it? Her voice was tinged with nostalgia. Michael offered a small smile. It's like stepping back in time. Except now, I see it with different eyes. When they pulled into the driveway, the sight of the old Victorian house stirred something deep in Michael. The weathered exterior, the overgrown garden Ethan had begun to tame, and the faint sound of wind chimes. Everything felt familiar yet different. It was as though the house had been waiting, holding its breath for his return. Inside, the house was much as Michael remembered. Margaret had preserved certain things, almost as if she believed he might walk through the door at any moment. His old room, untouched, still carried the scent of aged wood and faint traces of his cologne. He stood in the doorway, taking it all in. "You kept it the same," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Margaret nodded. "It was my way of holding on to you. Every time I came in here, I felt like you were still close." Michael sat on the edge of the bed, running his hand over the familiar quilt. "I thought leaving would make things easier for you, for both of us. But now I see how much pain I caused." Margaret joined him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We both suffered, Michael. But we're here now, and we have a chance to heal." Ethan, standing in the hallway, watched the scene quietly. He felt like an outsider in many ways, yet he knew his role in their story wasn't over. News of Michael's return spread quickly through the small town. Neighbors and old friends, many of whom had given up hope of ever seeing him again, began to stop by. Some were cautious, unsure of how to approach him after so many years. Others were openly emotional, embracing him and sharing their relief. Claire, Margaret's daughter, arrived the following day. She had grown up idolizing her older brother, and his disappearance had left a profound mark on her. When she saw him standing in the doorway, her emotions overwhelmed her. "Michael," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. He opened his arms, and they embraced tightly, the years of separation melting away in an instant. "I'm sorry, Claire," he said, his voice breaking. "For everything." Claire pulled back, shaking her head. "You're here now. That's all that matters." The reunion wasn't without its challenges. Some of Michael's old friends struggled to reconcile the man before them with the boy they had known. There were moments of awkwardness, of old wounds being reopened, but also of forgiveness and understanding. Despite the warmth of his family and the community, Michael couldn't escape the internal battle that raged within him. The guilt he carried wasn't something that could be erased overnight. Late at night, he would sit by the window, staring out into the darkness, his thoughts a whirlwind of memories and regrets. Margaret often found him in these quiet moments. She would sit beside him, offering silent support, sometimes sharing stories of their past, other times simply sitting in companionable silence. One evening, as they watched the stars, Michael finally spoke. "I don't know if I can ever forgive myself, Mom." Margaret placed a hand on his. "Forgiveness isn't about erasing the past, Michael. It's about learning to live with it and finding peace. You've come back to us, and that's the first step." Michael nodded slowly, her words sinking in. "I want to make things right," he said. "Not just for you, but for myself." Over the following weeks, Michael began to find his place again. He helped Ethan with the garden, the two forming a strong bond through their shared love of music and nature. Together, they transformed the once neglected space into a vibrant sanctuary, filled with life and color. Margaret watched from the porch, her heart swelling with pride. The house, once silent and somber, now echoed with laughter and music. Michael's presence brought a renewed energy, and the family began creating new memories to fill the void left by his absence. As Michael strummed his guitar under the old oak tree, Margaret realized that the melody, once a haunting reminder of loss, had become a symbol of hope and resilience. The days passed, each one bringing small but significant changes to Michael and Margaret's lives. The once quiet house now buzzed with activity. Michael, who had spent years avoiding emotional connections, found himself gradually opening up. His guilt had not vanished, but the burden grew lighter as he immersed himself in rebuilding his relationship with his family. Music, the thread that had kept him tethered to his past, now became a tool for healing. Each morning, Michael and Ethan would sit under the oak tree, playing duets. Margaret often joined them, her eyes closed as she soaked in the melodies. It was during these sessions that Michael began to share more about his years away. "I traveled a lot," he told Ethan one day. "Small towns, big cities, always looking for something to fill the emptiness. Music was the only thing that stayed with me." Ethan, who had grown to see Michael as both a mentor and a friend, nodded thoughtfully. "It's funny how music can connect us, even when we're far apart." Michael glanced at his mother, who was tending to a flower bed nearby. "It was my way of staying connected to her." Every note I played, every song I wrote, it was like sending messages into the void, hoping she'd somehow hear them. Margaret, overhearing his words, smiled softly. I did, Michael. Every time I heard a familiar melody, I felt you were close. Claire became a frequent visitor, bringing her two young children to the house. They were initially shy around their newly discovered uncle, but Michael's gentle nature quickly won them over. He taught them simple tunes on the guitar, their laughter filling the air as they stumbled through the notes. One afternoon, Claire sat with Margaret on the porch, watching as Michael played with the children. It's like he never left, she said, her voice tinged with emotion. Margaret placed a hand over hers. He's back, and that's all that matters. We're getting a second chance to be a family. Even Ethan, who had come into their lives as a stranger, became an integral part of their newfound dynamic. His presence was a steadying force, and his friendship with Michael deepened through their shared experiences. Reintegrating into the community wasn't without its challenges. Michael attended a town meeting where he faced people who had long wondered about his disappearance. Some were curious, others skeptical, but the majority welcomed him back with open arms. During the meeting, the town's mayor, an old friend of the family, stood up to address the crowd. Michael Grant may have been gone for a long time, he said, his voice carrying warmth and authority, but he's one of us. Let's give him the same support we would any returning family member. The applause that followed was a testament to the town's forgiveness and willingness to move forward. Michael felt a wave of relief, knowing that he was no longer defined by his past mistakes. Inspired by the warm reception, Michael decided to use his talents to give back to the community. He began teaching music at the local community center, offering free lessons to children and adults alike. His classes quickly became popular, drawing people from all walks of life who were eager to learn from the man who had once been a mystery. One evening, after a particularly lively session, a young student approached him. "Mr. Grant," she said shyly, "why do you play music?" Michael knelt to her level, his expression thoughtful. "Because it helps me express things I can't always say with words. And it reminds me that no matter where I've been, music has always been my home." The student nodded, her eyes lighting up with understanding. "I want to find my home in music, too." Margaret, meanwhile, found herself rejuvenated. The years of solitude had taken a toll on her health, but with Michael's return, she felt a renewed sense of vitality. She started hosting small gatherings at the house, inviting neighbors and friends to join in the music and laughter that now filled her home. One such evening, as the house brimmed with life, Margaret pulled Michael aside. "You brought light back into this house," she said, her voice full of gratitude. "I haven't felt this alive in years." Michael hugged her tightly. "You were my light, Mom. Even when I was lost, you kept me going." The transformation of the once overgrown garden into a thriving space became a symbol of the family's healing journey. Flowers bloomed where weeds once grew, and the air was filled with the gentle hum of bees and the sweet scent of blossoms. Michael and Ethan worked side by side, their shared effort a reflection of the bond they had forged. As they stood back to admire their work one afternoon, Michael turned to Ethan. "Thank you," he said sincerely, "for everything." Ethan smiled. "We all need a little help finding our way sometimes." With Michael's return, life in the Grant household blossomed. Margaret's home, once filled with silence and shadows, now echoed with the sound of laughter, music, and conversation. Yet, even as the days grew brighter, there was an unspoken tension lingering just beneath the surface, an anticipation of what lay ahead. Michael's efforts to reconnect with his past extended beyond his family. He delved deeper into the journal Ethan's grandfather had left behind, searching for answers to questions that still haunted him. Each page revealed more about the time he had spent away, the friendships he had formed, and the struggles he had faced in his self-imposed exile. One morning, Ethan arrived at the house carrying an old, weathered box. "I found this in my grandfather's attic," he explained, setting it on the kitchen table. "I thought it might help fill in some gaps." Michael carefully opened the box, revealing a collection of photographs, letters, and sheet music. Among them was a photo of Michael and Richard standing in front of a small music venue, their guitars slung over their shoulders. Michael's eyes lingered on the image, memories flooding back. "This was taken just before our last performance together," he said softly. "It was the night I realized I couldn't keep running." Margaret, seated beside him, reached for his hand. "Why didn't you come home then?" Michael sighed, his gaze fixed on the photo. "I wanted to, but I was scared. I wasn't sure if I could face you, or if you'd even want me back." Margaret's voice was firm yet gentle. You've always had a place here, Michael. No matter what. Ethan pulled out a letter from the box and handed it to Michael. This one's addressed to you. Michael unfolded the letter, his expression shifting as he read. Richard's words were heartfelt, encouraging Michael to return to his roots and reminding him of the power of reconciliation. The letter ended with a simple yet profound statement. It's never too late to find your way home. Buoyed by the discovery, Michael decided to organize a special event at the community center, a music night dedicated to Richard's memory and to the power of connection. The idea quickly gained traction, with townspeople eager to participate and support the Grant family's renewed presence in the community. Preparations for the event brought a flurry of activity. Michael worked tirelessly, coordinating with local musicians, preparing performances, and ensuring everything would go smoothly. Ethan and Margaret helped where they could, their shared efforts strengthening the bonds between them. As the day of the event approached, Michael found himself both excited and nervous. The music night would be more than a tribute. It would be a public acknowledgement of his journey, a way to close the chapter on his years of absence and begin anew. The day before the event, a knock on the door brought an unexpected surprise. A man in his early 50s stood on the porch, holding a guitar case. His rugged appearance and easy smile hinted at a life spent on the road. "Michael Grant," he asked, his voice warm. Michael nodded. "That's me. Can I help you?" The man extended a hand. "Name's Sam. I played with Richard years ago. He used to talk about you all the time." Michael shook his hand, a mixture of curiosity and gratitude in his eyes. "It's good to meet you, Sam. What brings you here?" Sam gestured to his guitar. "Heard about the music night. Thought I'd come by and offer my support." Margaret appeared in the doorway, her eyes lighting up at the sight of the visitor. "You're more than welcome to join us," she said. "The more, the merrier." Sam's arrival added a new layer of depth to the event. His stories about Richard and their shared musical adventures provided valuable context, enriching Michael's understanding of the man who had been such an integral part of his life. That evening, the house buzzed with the sound of rehearsals. Michael, Ethan, and Sam played together, their instruments weaving a tapestry of melodies that spoke of hope, resilience, and unity. Margaret sat nearby, her heart swelling with pride as she watched her son lead the group. As they finished their final song, Michael looked around the room, his eyes reflecting a deep sense of peace. "This feels right," he said. "For the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Margaret smiled, her voice filled with emotion. "You've always belonged here, Michael. And now everyone else will see it too." The stage was set for the music night, and with it, the culmination of Michael's journey. The anticipation built, not just for the event itself, but for the closure and healing it would bring. The night of the event arrived, and the community center was abuzz with energy. Rows of chairs filled quickly, and the hum of conversation mingled with the soft tuning of instruments. The stage, adorned with simple yet heartfelt decorations, bore a banner that read, "A tribute to music, connection, and homecoming." Margaret sat in the front row, her hands clasped tightly as she watched Michael prepare backstage. He was a different man from the one who had arrived weeks ago, his posture more confident, his eyes filled with purpose. Ethan stood beside him, offering quiet encouragement. "Are you ready?" Ethan asked, handing Michael his guitar. Michael nodded, a determined smile on his face. More than ready. The lights dimmed, and the audience hushed as Michael stepped onto the stage. He took a moment to scan the crowd, his eyes landing on Margaret. She gave him a reassuring nod, and he felt a surge of warmth. "Good evening, everyone," Michael began, his voice steady. "Tonight is about more than music. It's about connection, about finding our way back to the people and places that matter most." He strummed the opening chords of his first song, a piece he had written during his years away. The melody was haunting yet hopeful, a reflection of his journey. As he played, the room seemed to hold its breath, each note resonating deeply with the audience. The song ended to thunderous applause, and Michael introduced Ethan and Sam to join him on stage. Together, they performed a series of songs that ranged from soulful ballads to upbeat, foot-tapping tunes. The music flowed effortlessly, a testament to the bond they had formed. As the evening progressed, Michael paused between songs to share stories about his time with Richard and the role music had played in keeping him grounded. He then turned to the audience, his expression thoughtful. "There's one person who's been my anchor, even when I was lost," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This next song is for her." He began to play the melody that had first drawn Margaret out of her house weeks ago. The familiar tune filled the air, and tears streamed down Margaret's face as she recognized the song Michael had composed for her when he was just a teenager. The room fell silent, save for the gentle strumming of the guitar. The song spoke of love, resilience, and the unbreakable bond between a mother and her child. By the time Michael played the final note, there wasn't a dry eye in the audience. As the applause erupted once more, Michael set his guitar aside and stepped off the stage. He approached Margaret, who stood to meet him, her eyes shining with tears. Without a word, he embraced her tightly, the audience erupting in cheers and applause. In that moment, the weight of the past seemed to lift, replaced by the warmth of love and forgiveness. The community, witnessing this powerful reunion, felt a collective sense of catharsis. Michael returned to the stage for one final song, a lively, joyous piece that brought everyone to their feet. People clapped, danced, and sang along, the room filled with an overwhelming sense of unity. As the event came to a close, Michael addressed the audience one last time. "Thank you for welcoming me back," he said. "This isn't just a homecoming for me. It's a reminder that no matter how far we stray, there's always a way back." The applause that followed was deafening, a reflection of the community's support and love. Michael, Margaret, Ethan, and Sam stood together on stage, basking in the shared triumph of the evening. Back at the house that night, the family gathered around the fireplace, their hearts full and their spirits lifted. Margaret, holding Michael's hand, felt a peace she hadn't known in years. "You've given us all a gift tonight," she said softly, "and I couldn't be prouder." Michael smiled, his heart swelling with gratitude. "You gave me the strength to find my way back, Mom. I'll never take that for granted." The night ended with a quiet sense of fulfillment, the family ready to embrace whatever the future held. In the weeks following the music night, life in Margaret's home found a comforting rhythm. Michael, now fully integrated into the community, spent his days teaching music, tending the garden with Ethan, and sharing meals with Margaret and Claire's family. The once lonely house had become a hub of activity, brimming with laughter and the hum of guitars. Margaret, rejuvenated by her son's presence, often reflected on how far they had come. The dark years of silence and uncertainty were now a distant memory, replaced by a sense of wholeness she hadn't felt in decades. Michael's journey of self-discovery continued as he deepened his relationships with those around him. He made it a point to spend time with Claire's children, teaching them not only music but also the value of resilience and family. They adored their uncle, and their bond with him grew stronger each day. Ethan remained a steadfast presence, his friendship with Michael evolving into something akin to brotherhood. The two often spent hours playing music under the old oak tree, their melodies a constant reminder of the journey that had brought them together. For Michael, these moments were a testament to the healing power of love and connection. "It's not just about the music," he once told Ethan. "It's about what the music represents: hope, forgiveness, and the ties that keep us grounded." The garden, now in full bloom, had become a symbol of the family's transformation. Flowers of every color adorned the space, their vibrant hues reflecting the renewed spirit of the household. Margaret often sat on the porch, watching as Michael and Ethan worked side by side, their laughter carrying on the breeze. One afternoon, Claire joined her, a tray of lemonade in hand. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" she said, nodding toward the garden. Margaret smiled. "It's more than beautiful. It's a reminder that even the most overgrown, neglected spaces can flourish again with a little care." Claire squeezed her mother's hand. "Just like us. As the seasons changed, so did the family's perspective on the future." Michael began making plans to host regular music workshops, inviting both locals and visitors to learn and connect through music. The idea was met with enthusiasm, and soon, the community center buzzed with new life. Margaret, proud of her son's achievements, found joy in seeing him thrive. She often attended the workshops, her presence a quiet but powerful source of encouragement. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, Michael turned to her. "You know, Mom, I used to think I didn't deserve this, didn't deserve to come back. But now I see that coming home was the best decision I ever made." Margaret placed a hand over his. "We've all made mistakes, Michael. What matters is that we learn from them and keep moving forward." Michael nodded, his heart full. "Thank you for never giving up on me." Margaret's eyes glistened with tears. "You were always worth waiting for." The family's journey had a ripple effect on the town. Inspired by Michael's story, others began to reconnect with loved ones, mend broken relationships, and find solace in their shared humanity. The town, once divided by time and distance, had become a close-knit community where music and compassion brought people together. For Margaret and Michael, the transformation was profound. Their story, one of loss, hope, and redemption, served as a beacon for those seeking their own paths back to love and belonging. A year later, the Grant household was filled with the sounds of life and music. The once quiet home had become a sanctuary for family, friends, and the community. Michael's music workshops had flourished, drawing people from neighboring towns. The garden, now a vibrant masterpiece, served as the perfect backdrop for gatherings. On a warm summer evening, Margaret sat under the old oak tree, a serene smile on her face. Michael, Ethan, and Claire's children played music nearby, their laughter blending harmoniously with the melodies. It was a picture of peace and fulfillment. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the scene, Margaret closed her eyes, her heart full. She had waited decades for this moment, a home filled with love, music, and the people who mattered most. Michael's voice broke through her thoughts. "Mom, we're playing your favorite next." Margaret opened her eyes, smile widening. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." The melody began, familiar and comforting, a symbol of their shared journey. It was a song of homecoming, of love that endured across time and distance. And as the music filled the air, Margaret knew they had truly found their way back to each other.